Welcome. Today we're going to be discussing checking the storm and some of the more important principles, rules, concepts, theories, and strategies within the technique. But before we get into that, let's talk a little bit about its history. Checking the storm falls into our yellow belt curriculum, which was actually one of the last techniques created into the system. The reason they were created last was it's an introductory course for the practitioner. So keeping that in mind, let's look at checking the storm from a beginner's perspective. What is the strategy behind it? Again, we're dealing with a weapon, so the strategy, the simplest way to think about it, is to evade and cover up. Right? At that point, you can decide whether you want to engage or disengage from the opponent. So now that we talked about the basic strategy, let's talk about how we actually do that. Remember, we always have rule number one, establish a base. So as they're coming in, we're going to get into our stance. So why are we getting into a stance? And is this a good stance to get into? Well, if you think about it, not really, right? A cat stance is not the optimal stance to be in if I'm fighting a guy with a weapon, right? We want to be into our neutral ball. But why are we in the cat? Well, like I said, what was the strategy? I evaded, I covered up, but I may not want to engage. So this is called the intersection position. So from here, I can decide to disengage, I can decide to engage, I can decide to continue going in that direction. So there's a lot of things we can do from this position, which is why we're getting into the stance. But let's talk about getting into a stance. There are three reasons why we do that: stability, mobility, and availability. So in this case, we're giving up some of our stability so that we are more mobile and that we have our weapon available for us to strike him immediately. So now that we talked about that, let's talk about a couple other concepts that are introduced with the first maneuver. Controlling the gap. So this is one of the main concepts of this technique. As he's coming in, I have to determine where I'm stepping in relationship to my opponent. If you notice in this instance, I have disengaged from my opponent. I can't kick him. So this would be one of those prime examples where I want to disengage and leave, right? I might do the opposite and step really close to my opponent, which again, I can't kick him. So I might have to disengage and leave. So the idea is how to control that gap so that you know your range of where you're going to be so that you can effectively hit your opponent. And then this brings us to another concept, the outer rim theory. What that means is if I draw a line from my eyebrows to my groin and from shoulder to shoulder, I get an oval shape that is my outer rim. So what that means is anything inside that outer rim is important to me and I need to protect it. Anything outside that outer rim is really not bothering me and I shouldn't go looking for it. So we have a general rule that says stay within your outer rim. So if you take a look at my beginner, I'm evading and then I'm covering, which I'm staying within my outer rim. So the idea is, there's my outer rim, I'm going to be staying there, and I'm just happening to move out of the way. So the thing you don't want to do, remember especially as a beginner, is to try to block the stick. I don't want to go outside my outer rim because one, I no longer have an anchored elbow, and two, I've exposed a big zone here that he can take advantage of. So keeping that in mind, this is going to bring us into another concept that we introduced, which is to always have a check on the weapon. So if you notice, we are constantly keeping our hands covering and checking the weapon. So now let's talk about an advanced concept. Remember, this is done for a beginner, but once you get better or you start understanding more concepts, we have a big important concept or principle in Kenpo, which is called economy of motion. So if you notice, it's not economical for me to step to my right flank and then move my left foot to the right flank before I kick to the front left. Like, that's a lot of wasted movement. So the better way to do this would be to go from point of origin, where I step to the right flank, and now from point of origin, I kick the opponent directly. And again, I would still be using my controlling the gap to where I'm stepping, but so that I can kick him effectively and fast. So this brings in the concept of considerations. There are rules that we have and principles that we have, and you have to consider which ones take precedence over the other. Am I more advanced and I want to start engaging this opponent immediately? Am I less advanced and want to be more protective so that I can get out of there? These are all things that you have to take into consideration, and obviously the environment also dictates which one you would end up doing. So now let's move on to the next piece. So once we decide to move, regardless of which way you do it, let's continue with the economy of motion principle. Notice what I just did. I landed, and now I have to do it and then rotate so that I can then deliver the weapons. That's, again, wasted time. So the better way to do that would be that once I kick, I am rotating in place so that I have everything ready to go, which brings in two new concepts: body fusion and fixed spatial cocking. So what I mean by that is, if you take a look at my left hand, once I kick, I am disassociating this arm from my body so that when I rotate, the arm stays fixed in space. The opposite is true for my right hand. If you take a look at my right hand, it is doing what's called body fusion. It is now attached to my body so that when I rotate, it stays in the same relation to my body as it was before. So no matter what I'm doing, the arm's going to stay in place. And again, the opposite is true for the other hand. No matter what I'm doing, it's going to stay in that space. So now that we got into that, let's talk about the final maneuvers. So here we have a general rule that says anytime you're going to kick, you should cross kick. But this brings in the concept of purposeful or compelled. There are reasons why we do things, because we want to or we have to. In this case, again, the concept of the technique was to control the gap. If I'm too close to kick the front leg, even though the rule says that I should cross kick, I might have to go to the rear leg. If I'm not close enough to hit the rear leg, I might be forced to have to go to the front leg. So the idea is to control the gap. You have to decide when you're planting your foot where I'm going to put this foot so that I can gauge where I'm going to be able to hit effectively. And then regardless of which leg you hit, the idea is to do a side kick with the back foot. So now let's talk about the last place where we're going to do the controlling of the gap, which is at the end. If you notice, we're still here and the guy still has the weapon, so I can just step away, but what that does is exposes my center line and it keeps me in range of the stick. So we don't want to do that. The way you want to do this is, again, remember the idea of the technique. Cover up, keep a check on the weapon. So we want to make sure we have a check on the weapon at all times. So we're going to be doing our front crossover, step out, and then step back. And the reason we're doing that is for two reasons. Number one, distance. If you notice, I've created a safe enough distance where he can no longer reach me with the weapon. Number two is environmental awareness. As I am crossing out, I am surveying the environment to make sure there are no multiple opponents or threats that I have to deal with. So now that we talked about all that, let's do the technique one time so you can see it. Up. We hope this video helps you understand the American Kenpo system a little bit better. Thank you very much.